Pick a game.
What was the first horror game you ever actually finished? What was the first time you were actually brave enough to make your way through all of the fear to find yourself at the other end? I can't be 100% certain, but I'm pretty sure mine was Resident Evil 4. Back in 1999, my family decided to move to the first and only house we'd ever bought, and the day we actually moved was on my birthday. I was a bit upset to say the least, having to leave all my friends on my birthday. As unceremonious as it was, my parents tried to make up for it with the one thing that would make me happy. They bought me a few video games. Now, I'm not sure what I got. I think they were Spyro the Dragon and Cool Borders 2, but I can't be positive. Why? Because my parents had also bought themselves a game to try that forged a much stronger memory in my mind that night. The first Resident Evil. I wasn't supposed to play it, but it was my PlayStation, so naturally I snuck the game into my room and played it anyway. That was a mistake. To this day, that game is the scariest game I can play. Something about the design of Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 just really hits the right notes for me. That night, I got all the way past the first zombie and made my way into the hallway where the dogs jump out at you through the window. I've never powered off a console faster in my life. I didn't beat that game for at least a decade, and it still leaves me fearful. Resident Evil 1 wasn't the first game I'd ever found scary. Echo the Dolphin and Harry in the Haunted House also come to mind, but it was the first horror game I'd ever played. And though I'd played other horror games after that, none really scared me again until Resident Evil 4. Though I'd watched someone go through some of Resident Evil 2 before then, and some of the first game, Resident Evil 4 was the first time I'd picked the series back up. It was released on January 11th, 2005, but I didn't play it until like 6 months later, when the PS2 release was nearing. I had a friend with the GameCube version, and he was desperate to get me to try the game. I'd seen reviews of many of the other Resident Evil games, and they were all the exact same formula as the first game. I wasn't really interested, but he assured me this game was different. I'd just gotten a PS2 that last December, and knew that that version of Resident Evil 4 would come with more content. So I took him up on his offer, figuring that this was an easy way to see if the game was worth picking up for my PS2 without having to buy it just to find out. That was a smart decision, because holy crap, that game was amazing when it first released. It looked great, the QuickTime events, which were a new fad at the time, were tasteful and interesting, the gunplay was fun, the writing was great, and damn, it was scary. I couldn't play it for more than maybe an hour or so at a time before I just couldn't take anymore, and would have to shut it off. Resident Evil 4 was a masterpiece at the time, hence why it was the first horror game I finished. I technically never finished the GameCube version since my brother and I shared the console, swapping it between our rooms every few weeks, but I played through the PS2 version at least half a dozen times. So how does it hold up today? Resident Evil 4 begins by recapping the events of both Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 2. It's particularly keen on explaining RE2's events, since this game also stars Leon S. Kennedy. He quit the police force after the incident at Raccoon City, and is now effectively a Secret Service member for the President of the United States. While Leon used to be a wholesome, green, but driven young man who just wanted to help people, now he's a bit more rugged and a lot more snarky. He's still a man who ends up getting caught in an unbelievably dark and dangerous chain of events, but he seems more comfortable with it this time. Leon has been tasked with saving the president's daughter, Ashley Graham, who has recently been kidnapped by some sort of cult who's hiding out in rural Spain. The atmosphere of the village immediately spells danger, though it's not overtly terrifying. Instead, it takes a much more tactful approach, with silence and muted, almost dead colors selling you on the tension. This is easily the best thing about Resident Evil 4, is its ability to sell you on the horror. It's not always trying to be scary, but when it is, it does it much better than most games. After a confrontation with a few locals, Leon realizes that there's something definitely up with these people. They're not acting normal at all, with little in the way of self-preservation instincts, even when clearly in mortal danger. What's more, they seem to have strapped grenades to birds, but luckily, they never taught the birds what to do with the grenades, meaning it just ends up as extra ammo for the smart player. All jokes aside, Resident Evil 4 is a rather linear game, though it does still exhibit some of the overlapping freedom from the previous games. You will revisit areas as you go, but there's never really much in the way of backtracking. Keep moving forward and you'll find your way. As far as the horror itself goes, the game relies on a mixture of atmosphere, surprises, the number of enemies present, and limited supplies to drive the player's fear. Not every environment and enemy is scary, but not every environment and enemy is intended to be scary. While the player saves at typewriters still, they don't have to worry about finding ink ribbons anymore. Saving can be done as many times as you want. Everything else, however, is still rather limited. It earns the title of survival horror. Unlike previous games, enemies can drop healing items, ammo, etc., but you're still limited by the amount of enemies there are, so managing your supplies is of the utmost importance. Wasting stuff can get you in big trouble. This game also has currency and a merchant which you can buy weapons and other things from, as well as upgrade those weapons. With such limited supplies, players will often find clever ways to conserve ammo, like using a pistol when a sniper rifle would be more effective. It's a constant balance of risk and reward between how much health you're willing to risk wasting versus your ammo count. Healing items are just as limited, so it comes down to knowing which you can sacrifice more, health or ammo. Most players will find a combat loop fairly quickly that becomes a core part of the experience if you want to be as efficient as possible. That loop involves getting either headshots or shooting the enemy in the knee and then performing the kick or the suplex, depending on where you are in the game. Then, if safe, you knife the enemy until they stand back up. If you want to take it a step further, many players will forgo the pistol for the TMP. If you're light on the trigger, you can use the TMP just like a pistol, firing one shot at a time. It therefore essentially works exactly like a pistol that has much more ammo per clip, and when you find ammo for it, you'll find many more bullets at once, sometimes up to 50 or more. And if you want to push it even further, you can use the knife as a pistol replacement for hitting the enemies in the head or knees. This is extremely dangerous, but it can allow you to defeat basically any normal enemy without using a single bullet. There have been entire runs using nothing but the knife. Still, I don't think any of this is entirely necessary, because you can end up running out of space in your attaché case anyway, if you collect too much junk. Just like the previous games, your inventory space is limited, but cleverly, the spaces you have for storage are a bit more open in design. Instead of things either taking up 1 or 2 spaces, they'll take up an amount of space based on their size. The player can then rearrange objects freely, moving and turning them to try and cram as much stuff into their inventory as possible. This allows for a great amount of creativity in inventory management, and actually turns it into an interesting little diversion, almost like a minigame. Or you can just let things fall where they lie and only rearrange when absolutely necessary. The game will put things in starting from the top left corner down to the bottom right corner, but it will always find a way to fit something in if it can without moving any of this stuff that's already in your inventory. This includes rotating objects. Gunplay itself actually works a lot like the previous games, though the new perspective might fool you into thinking otherwise. Effectively, this game still uses tank controls. There's no strafing. Instead, left and right turn Leon, with up and down making you move forward and backwards. The player can freely aim by pressing the aim button and moving the left stick around, and the knife is now mapped to its own button. The player sees everything from a behind-the-back perspective, but aiming shifts things to a much closer, over-the-shoulder view. Most people agree that Resident Evil 4 pioneered this view, or at least popularized it. One other thing Resident Evil 4 became known for was the fact that you can indeed get different reactions from enemies by shooting them in different parts of the body. Headshots and knee shots open up melee opportunities, as previously stated. Obviously, that means they're generally the best option, but they're more difficult to pull off than body shots. Body shots might stagger opponents briefly, as will shooting them in the arms. If an enemy is holding a weapon, you can shoot at their hand to make them drop it. You can also shoot thrown weapons out of the air, and blow up thrown explosives with a well-placed shot. Wooden shields can have holes blown into them to create openings to do damage, or can be destroyed altogether. If an enemy is about to breathe fire using a torch, shooting them as they rear back will instead cause them to catch themselves on fire. There's a lot of attention to detail, and a lot of variety here. Honestly, it's more than most games have today, leading to a lot of strategic choices you can make. One of my favorite things to do is rush enemies who are holding dynamite, as other enemies close in on them. Then you turn around and run right back as they throw their dynamite. Since they throw the dynamite based on where you are, they'll practically drop it at their own feet, blowing them and all of their friends up. The final core aspect to combat is the risk of mutation when you kill an enemy. Rather than being zombies, the enemies you're facing are a bit different here. They're known as ganados, and they've become hosts to a parasite called Las Plagas. Las Plagas has a chance of exposing itself when you kill a ganado, effectively giving the enemy a second life and making them more dangerous. My friends and I have always called this the act of plagating, so that's what I'm going to call it for the rest of the review. There are a few types of Las Plagas, and enemies can plagate in a few different ways. The most basic is essentially a tentacle with some sort of blade on the end. There are spider-like bugs that will detach and chase you around, and a giant worm centipede-like thing that will instantly rip Leon's head off if he gets too close. Luckily, Las Plagas' weakness is intense light, meaning a flash grenade will immediately kill any enemy who is plagated. There are other types of enemies as well, such as bugs that can turn invisible and spit acid, wolves who have Las Plagas erupt from their backs, huge guys with chainsaws, and regenerators. Regenerators are super tall, super creepy enemies, who are sometimes covered in spikes, in which case they're known as Iron Maidens, that can attack in pretty much any situation you put them in. They can also regenerate limbs, and take so much damage that they're effectively invincible unless you hit their weak points. They're my absolute favorite enemy in any horror game, simply because they're so damn unsettling. But I plan to talk a bit more about them in a future video, wink wink, so for now I'll leave it at that. Herbs are back, and can still be combined. However, blue herbs are gone, since there's nothing that poisons you in Resident Evil 4. Instead, they're replaced with yellow herbs, which cannot be taken by themselves. Yellow herbs need to be combined with either a green or a green-red. When consumed, they'll raise your maximum health a bit. One other major aspect to gameplay here is the inclusion of Ashley as a companion. This was the first time I really saw people start to complain about escort quests, and might have even been where the term was first coined. Ashley, the president's daughter, joins you a short way through the game. She will then follow you and your orders for most of the rest of the story. She has her own health, and has no weapons or protection. She can do things like duck if you need to shoot where she's standing, pull levers, and hide in pre-designated hiding spots. Other than that though, she's something that really needs to be protected. You can shoot and kill her if you're not careful, and if a ganado carries her to an area exit, you lose. I don't find Ashley to be particularly annoying, as she's usually rather good at staying out of the way. However, she doesn't quite understand how to run from enemies, which can get her into trouble. Plus, she doesn't do anything particularly useful like pick up items for you. Luckily for most people who do find her annoying, she tends to get captured. A lot. Meaning at least half of the game is spent without her in tow. Her health can be upgraded just like Leon's, though I'd only advise doing that after you max his health pool out first. Finally, combat is broken up by puzzles and exploration. I wouldn't think of these purely as separate entities, though there definitely are sections more dedicated to one or the other. The puzzles in Resident Evil 4 aren't too different from previous games, relying mostly on bringing an item to an area to unlock a new area. As such, most of them aren't really puzzles, they're more just general exploration. But there are parts that are actually puzzles, though none of them are too difficult. One example is in the church early on, where you're tasked with lining patterns of light up with the same patterns on a piece of stained glass. These are pretty welcome additions because they're never so complicated that you get frustrated. So let's begin this section where we left off in the previous one. The puzzles in Resident Evil 4 tend to be a bit of a breath of fresh air. However, there's one section in particular that I just don't really enjoy, because it's so dense with difficult combat puzzles. Chapter 4 is a pain. It has some great ideas, and I particularly like sections like the small tower part, where you need to destroy planks of wood to get the gears for the bridge to turn. But a lot of it has large punishments for failure that can snowball fast, leading to checkpoint restarts often being a more effective solution to problems than actually dealing with the cards you've dealt yourself. There is one part in the game where you can play a little puzzle exploration section as Ashley herself. I think of it sort of like the Clank sections in earlier Ratchet & Clank games, before his gameplay became a bigger focus. It's just a simple diversion that changes up the thought processes of the player, since it requires you to deal with enemies without using guns. The bosses in Resident Evil 4 offer up some fantastic variety, though a few of them don't quite work. The second, optional fight with El Gigante is frustrating, because the game asks you to shoot boulders being held above so that they fall on his head. Unfortunately, the camera is a bit too close, and you can't turn up the aim sensitivity, meaning it's really difficult to time the boulders correctly. You can't see both El Gigante and aim at the boulder simultaneously, but focusing on El Gigante and then quickly aiming up to the boulder is difficult because Leon aims so slowly. There are some small things that make up for this, however. For example, that boss is purely optional, with the alternative being the Bea sisters, 2 chainsaw-wielding women, as well as a bunch of Ganados. You can even do both fights if you want. There's also a wolf that you can rescue early on, which will make the initial fight with El Gigante much easier, since the wolf will distract him. Later on, with the final El Gigante fight, where you have to fight 2 at once, you can open up a lava pit in the middle of the room, which will immediately kill one of the monsters if they fall in. The right-hand fight starts with you dodging attacks while you explore the area, with him completely hidden from you. Once you turn on the power to the elevator, he'll reveal himself, corner you, and you have to find a way out of the situation. If you wait long enough, you can simply escape without killing him. However, you can also wait for him to get close and knock down liquid nitrogen tanks that'll freeze him, allowing you the chance to do massive damage. Overall, the AI in this game is rather smart, and really dynamic. Enemies will occasionally try to dodge attacks, will shield their faces, know how to run rather quickly, and to navigate areas really well. But beyond that, the game has a fantastic AI director that tailors the experience to how well you're doing. The amount of enemies that spawn, how much loot they drop, how often they'll plogate, and how strong they might be will change depending on your current situation. The game always tries to maintain tension and difficulty while still making every encounter manageable. And for the most part, it does an absolutely fantastic job. The same randomization and alteration is done to many of the crates and stuff you can find loot in as well. From my experience, difficulty in the PS2 version has been ratcheted up, though I'll touch on that a bit more later. The shooting controls in Resident Evil 4 employ an automatic handshake that will get more severe the more dangerous the situation is. I've never found it to be detrimental to the experience during normal gameplay, instead with it just being a bit of a nice touch to keep you on your toes. In the shooting range, however, this handshake is absolutely murder. I hate it, I hate it, I hate it. And that's exactly why I've never wasted my time in the shooting range, because the precision required can be insane sometimes, but the handshake makes that really difficult. Because of that, there's just enough luck involved that I find it obnoxious as heck. The controls also double up on the problems because of the lack of strafing. Without the ability to strafe, moving straight left or straight right is an absolute chore. Just like most games in the series, the player has access to a quick turn ability for instant 180s, but if you're wanting to do anything other than turn completely around, it gets a bit more difficult. You almost have to think of Leon like a car, hitting the apexes of corners for maximum efficiency. He turns rather slow when you're standing in place as well, which doesn't help the problem. I don't want the controls to be more like a shooter, because it gets rid of a lot of the tension when you can just skirt around enemies with ease. But because there's no option to turn up movement sensitivity, the control feels heavy and stiff. It's not really an enjoyable type of awkward, at least for me. Apparently, the PS2 version's controls feel more sluggish than the GameCube, so that might have something to do with it. I haven't played the GameCube version for over a decade, so I couldn't tell you for sure. The weapons in the game, though, are rather interesting. Most of them have great give and take, offering something uniquely better in some areas than others. The Red 9 pistol is really powerful, but it's slow in basically every way. The Punisher, meanwhile, is a rather weak pistol, but it can shoot through multiple enemies at once. The regular old shotgun may be outclassed in most ways by the other shotguns, but it can be upgraded to do max damage from any range. Interestingly enough, upgrading a weapon's clip capacity will automatically refill it, which can be useful if you're running particularly low on something like rifle or magnum ammo. Or in the case of the Striker's final upgrade, will automatically give you 100 free shells. This also can save on inventory space, by the way, because you can hold more ammo in the gun rather than having to hold it in the inventory. The quicktime events during gameplay are, as stated earlier, rather tasteful in this game. Most of them are used for things like dodging attacks or obstacles, but the buttons you're expected to press are usually limited to 2 or 3 random selections, and you're given ample time to react most of the time. In cutscenes is where I can see the divisive nature of them more. Failing any quicktime event during a cutscene is instant death, which means watching the scene over again and again until you succeed. I find this fun, and it's still cool to see all of the optional death animations for failure. But this can be a bit intrusive and ruin the moment for some people. Plus, the PS2 version hitches at each of these moments, whereas the GameCube original was seamless. Speaking of the GameCube version, there are a lot of differences between that one, the PS2, and other versions. The simple changes come to later versions like the Wii, where you have motion controls, or the PS3, where they added a sort of auto-aim feature to the super secret laser weapon. The PS2 and GameCube version are where most of the changes lie, however. Some weapon stats got changed, like the normal rifle's maximum damage being raised by quite a bit for the PS2. They also added a bunch of content, like new weapons and even a new story mode for Ada, which I plan on doing a separate review for, hopefully later this year. As previously stated, cutscenes with quicktime events have hitches in the PS2 version. This is actually because the scenes are all pre-rendered in the PS2 version, but not in the GameCube. That also means that unlockable costumes are not reflected in cutscenes on the PS2, though it does have an extra one to play with, which puts Ashley in a suit of armor, making her invincible, and Leon in a 50s gangster suit, which gives the Chicago typewriter weapon infinite ammo.
Wait. Follow me.
The PS2 version also supports true widescreen and has a cutscene viewer, both absent from the GameCube. But the most drastic changes were done to the AI director and to the merchant. In the original version, the AI director was a lot more lenient on players, dropping high amounts of ammo and requiring the player to be doing much better before it would start really raising the difficulty a huge amount. Before I knew the game had an AI director like this, I assumed they just added many more enemies to the PS2 version, but in reality, it's just more willing to unleash them upon you. Meanwhile, the merchant is much more stingy with first aid sprays. In the GameCube version, he would always get 2 more first aid sprays in stock each time his inventory was updated, and these stacked in his inventory, meaning if you never bought any, he could have tons of them by the end of the game. And this would continue into New Game Plus. But in the PS2 version, his inventory maxes out at 2 first aid sprays, and he will only get more in stock when his inventory is updated and Leon is desperately low on healing items. That alone makes the game significantly more difficult. Resident Evil 4 is a master of atmosphere, graphical quality, sound design, and fear. It's not perfect, mind you, but most of the problems come with the shortcomings of the PS2 version and thus aren't in the other versions. The game is separated into 5 chapters, each with their own distinct feel. The first chapter is horror at its most basic, a person stranded in a town unknowing about what's going on. Things feel quiet, but also very hostile. It takes place during the day, meaning the fear is more psychological and less, "what's hiding in the shadow over there?" The second chapter is similar, though this part does take part at night. It's the one that finally reveals the true horrors to the player, and does emphasize the fear of shadows, so to speak. The third chapter feels more like a thriller about a psychotic cult. It feels like more organized horror. Where the previous chapters gave the impression that things were only loosely organized in this cult, and many of the terrible things you encountered were byproducts of something else, The fear and enemies in Chapter 3 feels calculated. These are truly sentient monsters. There's less in the way of tentacles and blood, and more in the way of tortured monstrosities. You've got enemies like the Garrador, a dude clad in armor and chains with Wolverine claws whose eyes are sewn shut. Las Plagas forms, meanwhile, are more fully formed enemies in Chapter 3, rather than masses of muscles with blades attached. Chapter 4 is like the cheesy B-movie of the bunch. It's absolutely nuts. It's not scary so much as it's dangerous and extraordinarily silly. You've got pits of lava with fire-breathing dragon statues hanging from the ceiling, a giant robot that chases you, a nest the size of a bus that's full of bugs that can become invisible, what looks like some sort of Egyptian ruin for no reason in the middle of Spain, and even suits of hostile armor that somehow house Las Plagas, despite the fact that armor isn't living so it can't be a host. It's crazy. Chapter 5 is sort of a mixture of all the previous chapters. You have crazy things like a crane game minigame where you pick up and dispose of enemies, a la Chapter 4 style horror. But it's also dark and super dangerous like Chapter 2, with many grotesque experiments and highly intelligent enemies. Sometimes it's even more like an action movie than horror. If I had to put it in its own category, I think the focus would be on the experiments. It's sort of the science gone too far style horror theme, and feels more modern and industrial than the rest. Despite this eclectic mix, the game never feels too disjointed thematically. At the end of each chapter, you start to get hints of the next theme fed to you in small doses, so it feels rather organic. The writing in the game is really great overall, and has a great sense of humor. The characters don't necessarily feel human so much as they feel like walking one-liner machines, but it really works to the game's advantage here, because it provides levity in what's otherwise an extremely dark narrative.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
No way, Leon!
Way?
Are you out of your mind?
I knew you'd be fine if you landed on your butt.
You... So, after you take me back to my place, how about we do some, overtime?
Sorry.
There are a few issues, though. I'd say the biggest one is probably Krauser. Krauser himself isn't a bad character, I don't think, and his role in the story isn't terrible. The problem is that he apparently has a past with Leon that is not in any of the previous games. It's actually explained in a later game. It's brought up several times, but never explained, and it doesn't really matter. Krauser could have just as easily been a narcissistic ex-American soldier, rather than a narcissistic ex-American soldier that almost died in a helicopter crash and somehow knows Leon for some reason. The music can be rather chilling, particularly some of the more passive themes, like the one on the save screen. It feels lonely and hopeless. Other songs can be super unsettling. A standout for me is the main tension theme for Chapter 5, which is usually used around regenerators. It feels unstable and schizophrenic. The sound as a whole is great as well, with punchy effects, great voice acting, and a cohesive whole. Graphically, the game is beautiful as well, despite being over a decade old. It still looks rather great. There are some iffy textures, and it's not in HD or anything, unless you get the HD version, but even that has some really terrible textures that are unacceptable. But the models are expressive, the colors and animation are well crafted, and the environment design is truly inspired and varied. Unfortunately, a lot of this is undermined by the hardware limitations of the PS2. A lot of the effects that were in the original simply don't exist in the PS2 version, like heat haze during the third El Gigante fight and in other hot places in the game. And all of the cutscenes are muddy because they're pre-rendered. This is because both the cutscenes and a lot of the audio effects are highly compressed. Some sounds in particular are incredibly muffled, and stand out in a really negative way. They sound like they're coming out of a box. The game doesn't seem to have too much of an issue when it comes to frame rate, but it's definitely not perfect. Other than that, performance is really just fine. Beyond this though, there's a few silly things in the writing that confuse me. The game often says things like, the Los Illuminados, which makes no sense. Los Illuminados means the Enlightened Ones, so saying the Los Illuminados translates to the Enlightened Ones. It's also strange that Las Plagas is supposed to be a good thing that cleanses sins, but translates to the plague. It's like these Spanish people who have Spanish accents and can speak Spanish don't understand Spanish. Generally, people like to avoid plagues, not use them to cleanse sins. There's also a line that I can't really figure out, which the village ganados occasionally say. It sounds like he's saying something to the effect of "Él es cerca el niños," which would translate to "he's around the kids." I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure that I haven't seen any kids around. Just saying. Honestly, I wouldn't do too much to improve this game, because I think it's really great the way it is. I would loosen up the control a bit and add aim sensitivity options. I'd also remove the handshake feature when in the shooting range. I'd like it during normal gameplay. I'd also maybe allow the player to draw the camera out just a bit while aiming. That way, things like the second El Gigante fight aren't so clunky. By the way, while it's solved in later ports, and in the GameCube version, I would like all of the effects and features to be consistent, like the sound effects. I don't like it when some of the lines spoken by my enemies are super crisp and clean and other ones are really terrible. It's jarring. Most of all though, I would space the set pieces of Chapter 4 out throughout the rest of the game. While aesthetically it fits together well as a single chapter, gameplay-wise, it feels like a bunch of set-piece ideas that the dev team couldn't let go of, so they just shoved them all together into a single chapter. They play out one after another and can get exhausting. I mean, heck, Leon and the player are forced to leap for their lives twice within 20 minutes, once off of a minecart whose track has ended, and once from a broken bridge while being chased by a giant robot statue of the chapter boss. And both times, it's the exact same QuickTime events with the exact same animations. Either one of those didn't need to be there, or they needed to be spaced out. So that's Resident Evil 4. Is it a masterpiece? Yeah, I'd say it definitely is. It has its flaws, and for someone picking it up for the first time now, the controls might feel super aged. But give it just a bit of time and you'll quickly realize how well designed everything is. It's designed around these controls, and really intelligently. They really structured everything around making the controls feel as smooth as possible, while still making the player feel overwhelmed and underpowered. It's not perfect, but it's pretty dang close to it. So what do you guys think about Resident Evil 4? Have you played it? And if so, what version did you play? I always give my brother crap for beating the Wii version first, since aiming is so much easier, and there's no artificial handshake. Still, I can't deny that playing the game with motion controls works rather well. I'm getting off topic though. Tell me what you think about the game, and the review below. Leave a like if you like, subscribe if you're interested, and I'll see you in 2 weeks for another video.